In this video I'm going to show you the basics of how you mix a glaze. So you're going to want to begin by writing down your glaze formula in a notebook so that you can tick off the ingredients that you've added to your recipe as you go so that you don't get confused. It's a lot like what Matt describes as the white powder problem. A lot of the ingredients look very similar. I'm going to mix a recipe called Gold Metallic, which is a cone 6 glaze. So I've written my triangle 6 here as well. And then I keep track of this in my notebook for future references. You can take a photograph of your result too so that you have an example of it with you for later on. You'll also want to make sure that you label your test tile with that amount, with that name of that recipe and the temperature that you fired it to. So you're going to want to begin by normalizing your recipe. So by that I mean that you want to make sure that the base of your recipe is going to equal 100 grams. Alright, and I'll include another video on how to normalize your recipe if yours does not add up to 100 grams. So my base adds up to 100, but then I have 3 colorants that I'm going to add to my glaze. This is an unusual glaze. It's a heavy saturated metal glaze, so it has quite a lot of colorant in it. It has over 70 grams of colorant, which is very unusual. Typically you're going to have something, depending on which ingredient you're using, more in the range of under 10 grams, but we'll talk about that more specifically with our glaze mixing project later on in the semester. Okay, so most of the ingredients are underneath the silver tables in the studio, and they are labeled on the front with what is in them. And then we have some smaller ingredients, smaller amounts of ingredients up on the shelves that are also labeled. And they typically tend to be additives or colorants that you would put in your recipe. So if you have trouble locating something, you can ask Hayden or one of the studio assistants, or call me if you're having a lot of trouble. Okay, so I'm going to begin by showing you how to use this triple beam scale. So on the triple beam scale, you have typically some kind of a receptacle to hold the ingredients that you're going to measure, and you want to make sure that it's clean. So right now, you want to make sure that all of these measures are over to the left all the way. Now I also, I'm going to look over here and see that this balance here is down below the 0. So I need to bring it up a little bit here, which means that there needs to be more weight here. So I'm going to use this little black adjustment here to try to get my balance starting in the middle, so it's just hovering at 0. So this will take a little while. You're going to have to kind of mess with it to get it just right. And you do it, it's a little stiff, but just kind of do it gradually. Alright, it's starting to move up, but it's still a little bit low. Now sometimes it's hard to get it to move exactly right on with that black, but there's a little silver dial here on the back that you can push that will be a fine-tuning adjustment. So I'm going to just twist this a little bit, see if I can get it to balance at 0. It's getting closer. Sorry it's a little boring, but don't worry if it takes you a little while. So this is basically the tare weight of this cup. Now we also have some digital scales which you can use to mix glazes. There's one here, and it needs to be plugged in, so alright, so it is a little more straightforward. You just we'll put your container on here and make sure that you push the button so that you get a tare weight on it that will equal out to 0. So if you hit the 0 button a few times, it should go to 0. There are different kinds of scales. For measuring glaze testing, you want to have a very fine-tuned scale that will measure to the 10th or 100th of a percent. And I'll bring in a little test kiln too. Some of the scales, the old house digital scales that we have, don't really measure to a super fine 10th of a gram or 100th of a gram, and it can be difficult if you're trying to mix a glaze base that's just 100 grams. So I would recommend that you try the O-House triple beam scale for just a small glaze test. All right, so now we're at 0. And I'm going to begin with my first ingredient, the silica, which is going to be the glass former here. And I'm going to add 7 grams. So here I'm going to take and measure out 7 grams. Just get it right in the middle there. And then I've gotten the scoop from under the table. I'm just going to measure a little bit here at a time. All right. So you want to be wearing a mask when you do this. Sometimes I have a P100 respirator that I often wear for this kind of mixing, so that I don't breathe any of these dust particles here. All right, and this goes back on the scale. All right, and then I'm going to add 7 grams again, so I don't need to move it. I'll keep it at 7 of ball clay. Ball clay is a very plastic clay that we often use in recipes. EPK is probably a little more common, a kaolin clay. So this ball clay has a little more iron in it. It's kind of gray. It's very finely particled. It gives a lot of plasticity when we put it in our clay bodies. All right, this is and it has both alumina and silica, both glass formers here. All right. I think I went a little bit over there. It looks like I'm just a little beyond 0, so I think I'm going to take a little bit out. Maybe I'll just use part of my clean scoop for removing a little bit of clay. Yeah, it's so finely particled, I'm taking out a bit and it's not moving it much though. All right, that's a little closer to 0. I'll put that into my clean container here for mixing. Just get all the ingredients out. All right, and then the next ingredient is red art. Red art is also a kind of low temperature clay, and it has alumina and silicate, but it also has a lot of iron oxide, okay? So I need 86 grams of this. So I'm going to do 80 and 6. All right, on a little over. Take my clean scoop, put it back to 0. Just take your time and make sure it's right. So typically I have students do this in a pair, but with coronavirus we'll need to keep our distance from each other, but we'll figure out another way that 2 people can share in this work. All right, so I have 100 grams of base in my recipe, so I have alumina and silica from my clays, and the iron oxide is going to act as a flux in this recipe. It's going to help melt the alumina and silica. All right, and now I'm going to add some colorants. So I have manganese dioxide, 64. I'm going to move this to 6 and this one to 4. Now these tiny little hash marks can give me 1/10%, which I will need in my next ingredient, but not quite yet. All right. I'm going to use a different spoon here and scoop out some manganese. Manganese is pretty heavy, has a heavier molecular weight, and so it probably isn't going to need that much to get 64 compared to the clays that I was using. There we go, a little much. All right, pretty close here. Take a little more out. All right, I think that's pretty good. So now these colorants can be dirty, and you want to make sure that you use a clean scoop each time. Sometimes people like to put a little piece of paper inside the scoop or right directly on the scale so that they don't get things dirty with the colorants. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is copper oxide, and I need 4.3 grams of copper oxide. So I'm going to move this to 3/10. So that's 1, 2, 3/10, 4 and 3/10 here, and we are almost out of cobalt oxide. So hopefully I'll have enough here, and I don't. All right, so let me get a little more out of my scoop. Got a little bit more here. In the middle. Okay. Add that to my recipe. Alright, and then the last ingredient is going to be copper oxide. And for copper oxide, I'm going to need 7%. 7 grams. Measure out a little bit, make sure this is in the middle here. Copper. Now, if you're mixing a larger batch, and it might be wise to mix 200 gram batch for a test as opposed to 100 grams, you are going to want to make sure you do the math. So if you have a 100 gram base, you're going to want to multiply every ingredient by 2 so that you get 200 grams. So make sure you do your math on your paper, and then you'll know what you have in the, I should have been checking these off, but then you can kind of check them off as you go. All right, we got 7 grams. All right, looks good. Put this down in here. Now, you're going to want to dry mix a little bit with a dry brush. This will help distribute all the clay particles and the stains and the fluxes. All right. And then you might want to start with about 50% water. And so that would be, if this is a 100 gram batch, then I'm going to want to begin with 50 grams of water. So it's helpful. Every glaze is going to be different. It's going to depend on the amount of clay it might have, which will absorb more water. But you don't want to overdo it at first. So I'm going to take, I think I'm going to use the digital scale for this because it'll be a little bit easier. And I'll show you how that works too. So I'm going to move the triple beam out of the way here. And we'll get our digital scale. All right, and you can kind of turn it on by hitting the 0. So now it reads 0 here. All right, oops, I have my finger on it. It reads 0. And I'm going to put an empty container on there. And now that empty container weighs 73 grams. So in order to get the tare on it, I just push the 0 again, and it will 0 it out. All right, and now I'll carefully add a little bit of water here. So you don't want to add too much water to your glaze. Every glaze is a little different. Most glazes are going to want to be mixed to the consistency of kind of a half and half. This is still at 55. Try to remove a little bit more. All right, it's at 51. I think that's okay. But it's always better to go slowly and not add too much. So I'm going to start with 51 grams, and I'm going to take the dry material and put it down into the water, kind of mix it as I go. Now, you may want to end up using a, this clay has a lot of clay in it, so I can already tell that I'm going to need quite a bit more water. All right, as I'm mixing here, it's already becoming quite thick. All So I'm going to go ahead and just add water a little bit at a time. I still have quite a lot more dry material to add in, but I know that this particular glaze might like to be a little bit thicker than some. So these are all things that you kind of learn with experience, but generally you're going to want the mixed consistency to be a little bit like half and half. All right, so it's again thickening quite a bit and is lumpy. That will smooth out when I add, when I sieve it later, but right now I'm just going to add a little more water. Here. All right, and just continue to kind of mix this in. All right, I'm just going to go ahead and add the rest of it. All right, at this point I may want to go ahead and use my immersion blender, which is a small little blender that we have hanging on the pegboard behind the sink, to really mix this up well. So it's quite lumpy and quite thick. It doesn't really drip off my brush at all. I'm going to add a little bit more water. You know, and just kind of eyeball it. So I really do want it to be kind of like half and half. Still a little bit thick. If you add too much water, it's not going to give you a very accurate sample of this glaze. Right? And sometimes it takes a little while for all of the particles to really saturate, so the consistency can change, and it depends on the ingredients. Ingredients like Gersley borate are going to have a tendency to kind of gel out after a little while. You may have noticed that in our clear glaze that we use for cone 6. Okay, so now I'm going to get the immersion blender, and I'm going to blend it up here. I have to remove my light because I only have one extension cord that's going to work. And plug this in. Okay, so just be really careful with this not to lift it out of the liquid while you're mixing it. I don't want it to splash. I'm going to turn it down to kind of a low speed here. I don't want it to be too really kind of blend it up there. Again, it's still kind of thick. I'll show you here. So I'm going to add a tiny bit more water. Grams are going to be a little bit more water, a little bit easier to blend than just 100 because the drill blade doesn't really go all the way down in 100 grams very well. A little bit more. All right, I think that's pretty good. Now I'm going to rinse out my blade here. And I can take this off and rinse it in the sink. Just twist it off. Careful not to put your hand in the blade there. Now the manganese did splatter a little bit. I'm going to have to clean that up. I'll move this out of the way here with my sponge. And manganese, you do need to be careful of some of these colorants. You don't want to eat manganese. It releases fumes that are very dangerous to breathe, but it's not dangerous to touch. You just want to make sure you wash your hands really, really well. We do have rubber gloves. You can wear the gloves when you mix the glaze, especially if you have a cut on your hand or something like that. That's probably a good idea. Okay, I'm going to pause and get my test tile, and then we'll show you how to label the test tile.